Welcome to Faith Over Breakfast. You are listening to a podcast by Pastor Eric Deepen and Pastor Andy Littleton. If you enjoy Faith Over Breakfast, we encourage you to rate it on the Apple Podcast app, on Spotify, or Google Play. Thank you and enjoy the podcast. Welcome to Faith Over Breakfast. My name is Eric Deepen, and I am a pastor at the Village Church in Tucson, Arizona. Normally, I do Faith Over Breakfast with Andy Littleton from Mission Church, but today I am on my own, and this is a best of in a strange way. And when I say strange way, a best of Faith Over Breakfast, but it's going to be a crossover podcast where you get to hear one of the podcasts from Healing the City. It's called A Guide to Forgiveness. And I think it's really, really good. And so I thought I'd share it with the audience of Faith Over Breakfast. Many of you have heard it if you listen to Healing the City, which is the Village Church's podcast. But I wanted just to quickly chat about a few things when it comes to Faith Over Breakfast in particular. We have jokingly talked about people being, inside producers and that kind of thing. And I did want to highlight that as we do this podcast and as we do other podcasts like Healing the City, that we are looking for a little bit of help in making this happen. And so when you listen, there's a couple ways that you can help. Number one, and I think one of the most important ways to help, is to rate our podcast and give us a review. So if you haven't rated this podcast on Apple or Spotify, please just take a few seconds and rate it and write a quick review of it. So that's number one way to help. Number two way to help is to share it on your Facebook feeds, email it to people, promote it for us. That's very helpful. And number three, when you listen to the podcast, you'll note that there are a space where you can click to support it. And then there is an easy way to support it, $3 a month, $5 a month, $10 a month. And these things help us pay for the hosting of our podcast and maybe to replace some rubber bands on the microphones to hold them up, or replace any kind of electronic stuff that we might need to replace. So I don't want to be PBS and make a constant pitch for this, but one of the things that we are offering, if you do become a regular monthly supporter, is to put you on our little text message inside producer conversation so that you can have input into what Andy and I talk about. So I'm pretty excited about that. One of the things that's very helpful for Andy and I is to have topics to engage in. So I do appreciate that some of you send us topics, and they're definitely part of our conversation, and we try to address them as best we can. I want to say thank you very much for listening to Faith Over Breakfast. It's been so much fun just to chat with Andy, and it's built our relationship, so you've gotten to hear that as it's developed over the years. And also, hopefully, it's been a blessing to you. And I've loved many of the conversations we've had. So I would also like to promote on Faith Over Breakfast, our podcast, Healing the City. There are a lot of really great things on that podcast. In particular, you get to hear a lot of stories from people's lives at the Village, but also we address a lot of different thoughts and ideas. We talk about things like attachment theory. We talk about forgiveness. Right now, I'm in the middle of a really cool series interviewing my father, who has been a counselor in Tucson, Arizona for 30 years. They run a lot of workshops and trainings, and just to have my dad's wisdom recorded and to kind of offer that to other people is really exciting. So if you aren't following and listening to Healing the City podcast, I'm going to give you a little taste of that, and then hopefully you'll go follow Healing the City and enjoy everything that's offered there. Thank you very much, guys, for listening. Welcome to Healing City Podcast. My name is Pastor Eric Siepen, and I am sitting across from my beautiful wife, Pastor Susan Siepen, and we are going to talk to you about forgiveness. And so to start that conversation, I'm going to read out of Ephesians chapter 4, first few verses, and then the last verse of that chapter. So Paul starts out in Ephesians chapter 4. This is in the NIV, I believe, this way. As a prisoner for the Lord, then, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope when you were called, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. And then at the very end, he says, in verse 32, be kind and compassionate to one another. Forgive each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. Today we're going to talk about forgiveness and the motivations to forgive, or that Jesus has forgiven us and delivered us into the kingdom of God. And so today, Susan is going to give us some practical ways, or at least a framework to think through forgiveness. And she's done a lot of research on this, and she's thought it through. And so we're just going to give it a go. So Sue, kick us off here.
Yeah. So this is picking up in some ways from Module 6, where we started talking about forgiveness.
Yeah.
And we were anchored in a book by Fred Luskin called Forgive for Good. And it's been the most practical book I've read on forgiveness, partly because he defines forgiveness as the ultimate resolution to unwanted loss and grief. That's one of the definitions of it. So resolving loss and grief in our life is what he defines forgiveness as. And so there's really practical ways that he goes about helping people to forgive. And then, it's kind of part of a scientific research inquiry, like go to a country where there have been wars and people have done really awful things to each other. And then can you help the victims of those experiences recover and basically get their lives back? And so the idea of forgiveness is getting your life back in that context.
Right.
And there are ways that we can get our lives back from the things that seem like they've totally taken over our narrative.
Right.
So I find that very helpful. I think sometimes books on forgiveness tend to be a little bit vague, and it's hard to get a hold of, well, yeah, but how? How would you do this? So the process that he describes begins with developing space in your life where you're not thinking about the wrongs done to you. So you start looking around, enjoying the good things that are happening in your life, recognizing what's really good around you. And he refers to it as changing the channel. Like if your channel is stuck on this person, this wrong thing that happened, then change the channel. Don't give it so much space in your life.
And I think probably when he's writing this, or at least the way it's stuck in his head, he doesn't have a remote.
Right.
So you got to get up and change the channel on your TV. So there's a little effort in this process.
Yeah.
Of kind of re-narrating what's happening in your brain.
Yes. You have to start carving out space for good stuff.
Yeah.
And not give it all over to this bad thing.
Right.
That has happened, or even the bad things that have happened because the bad thing happened.
Right.
So
creating this sort of mountain narrative of bad on bad on bad, and this is why you're here. And, yeah.
Yes. So the first step is actually just to open some space for the good.
Yeah.
And that reminds me of things you've been talking about in sermons recently about, are you looking for all the symptoms, or are you looking for the signs of what God is doing? And sometimes we get stuck in a space where we're just only ever looking at symptoms. Like, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. And God invites us to look for the signs and say, well, God is doing something.
Right.
So that's the beginning, is starting to create a larger perspective.
Right.
And then he has people go through developing practices of safety. So entering into some sort of practice where you can calm your nervous system down and feel safe. There
are a lot of those on Humanicity podcasts.
Yes. Go back, revisit other podcasts and see what you can find. One of those that is possible is to just take time to imagine being in a space with Jesus and feeling the safety of his presence. Say, that would be an example. But the idea is to actually regularly practice something that creates a sense of safety for you physically and emotionally. And then to be able to think about the person or event that was wrong and continue to stay in that place of safety. So if you were going to do a meditation where you were thinking about being in the presence of Jesus, then to also imagine that person in the presence of Jesus, to start imagining or even talking to Jesus about, hey, this thing happened, and hold on to the safety, not to be more connected to the safety than to the difficulty of what happened.
The event or the situation.
To start kind of being able to hold them at the same time.
Yes.
Because that is what allows us to think wisely, to look at the other person potentially even with compassion, to hold some space for it and address it without just being thrown off by it, by the whole process.
All right. So we have the changing the channel, the creating of safety, and then the third one.
Then there's the acknowledgement of what you had hoped for, because we all hope for things. We maybe hoped that our mom would be really kind to us and take good care of us, not neglect us, be really concerned about our well-being.
Right.
Because that's what moms are supposed to be. And so to acknowledge what we hoped for and realize that the things we hope for don't always happen.
Right.
And it's not that we're excusing the mom, like saying, well, it's okay that it didn't happen. It's only saying, I hoped for this and it didn't happen. And the things I hope for, the things that people hope for don't always happen.
Right.
And so I think there's a really big difference between saying this thing happened and it wasn't wrong when it really was wrong. It's not the way things are supposed to be. And there's a difference between saying this person did something to me and it's okay that they did it. And that's not what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is actually looking at it and saying, I hoped that would happen. That was actually something that should have happened. Or I hoped that this wouldn't happen and it did. That thing wasn't supposed to happen. So something wrong happened here. And I'm not excusing it. I'm just recognizing I hoped for something other than that. And what we hope for doesn't always happen in this world. So to start heading into that
because it seems
way
to
of thinking.
Me that if you don't forgive, that there is some level of bitterness that's formed, and bitterness eats away at hope. And so part of this practice is to keep hope alive within you. It's to really acknowledge that you do have hopes and to own them.
Yeah. And so it's to say, I hoped for this. This did not happen. The thing that I hoped for.
Yeah.
And then to return to what is my overarching life intention? Like the thing that I actually want to build in my life, that I have the power to move towards, is something that I'm hoping for, that this did not keep me from getting. So it's a way of kind of restructuring our hope, of saying, I had put my hope on this thing and it didn't happen. But I still have a life trajectory that I'm working on. I still have things that I want to see happen in my life that I'm pursuing. I may still have, family might still be a really important value to me. And if my mom didn't give me the family I wanted, that hope, disappointed, doesn't keep me from pursuing my larger hope that I can still have a healthy family. I can still move in that direction.
Right.
So I think the maybe small h hope and the big H hope, starting to hold those and look at them as different things,
right,
is a piece of it. And then to return to the safe space again. So this is kind of a practice that would be done over time because we're rewiring our neurology as we do this. So typically you wouldn't have this go through this process just once. Maybe you can if it's, my husband didn't wash the dishes last night. But if it's something where there's this ongoing problem or there's a really major wrong that has happened, then it may take some time to repeat this process and step into the calm nervous system space and remember and reorient, really, from the thing that happened to the overarching narrative, that what happened to me doesn't prevent me from being able to do what I want to do with my life in the future and what I'm pursuing right now. So I think that is a repeated practice that can be undertaken. And
it really seems like that in itself is prepping you to even say the words, I forgive you, or I have forgiven.
Yes.
It's a preparation for that.
Yeah. And I think in this context, forgiveness is separate from reconciliation. So you can forgive a person without actually them ever asking you to forgive them.
Right.
You can forgive a person without ever telling them that you forgave them, because it's about your perspective on life changing, and it's about you getting your life back. So I think reconciliation may need to happen. There may be other things that need to happen outside of the actual forgiveness itself.
Right. And
they're not necessarily connected.
Right. So forgiveness is separate from reconciliation and justice.
Yep.
So how then do I forgive? What is it? What are some practical things to think through to help me in this? Because what you gave is practical, but I think then there's the next steps.
Yes. So part of forgiveness, as we mentioned in the other podcast, is this idea that we drop our demands that we have on people.
Right.
And another way of saying that, which the author of the book talks about, is that we have created unenforceable rules for another person. So we can think of demands as unenforceable rules. I had rules for this person. They broke my rules. But they're not paying for the broken rules. They're off living their life.
Right.
And I'm the one who is holding all of the accusations, as if I had, one of the examples that he uses is if we were, if you're doing a traffic tickets for all sorts of broken rules, but you can't actually deliver the tickets, and so you're just storing them in your car. So you're carrying around all the traffic tickets and
for all the violations
of your rules, but nobody else knows it.
Right.
And so some of it is just releasing the rules that can't be enforced and looking at them and saying, okay, I wanted those things to happen. They did not happen. They're probably not going to happen. I'm going to let them go. And I think that's a transition from having demands to having desires. So It goes back to hopes, right? So it goes back to, I hoped these things would happen. I can't enforce them. I can't make them happen.
Right.
I can feel disappointed that they didn't happen. And I can realize that I still have hopes and for other things that I'm going to move towards intentionally.
Right. So for example, early on in our marriage, one of my unenforceable rules was you will never embarrass me in public.
Yeah.
Which I also then, once I quote unquote maybe forgave you for those or don't have that, I just transferred it to my children.
Right.
You won't embarrass me in public.
Right.
And so that created a lot of control and anger inside of me because I couldn't control, in particular, little children.
Yeah.
I could use manipulation, not good. We if you listen to some of our podcasts, you've heard about manipulation not being good, but I can use it a little bit with you more effectively. With my kids, it was more difficult, especially as they were younger. They just did it all the time.
Right.
And so I have this. So it created a certain way of feeling about my children.
Yeah.
And so in order to forgive them for embarrassing me in public, I had to actually let go of that unenforceable rule.
Yes.
It's certainly I hope and a longing for them not to do that.
Right.
Or to do things that would do that. But it's then, so I have, when I let go of that rule, and I have forgiven them.
Yeah. Right.
Because I have released the control.
Yes. And I think of that as also other things in our marriage where, over the course of the first few years of being married, you realize what you want from the person isn't always what you're going to get from the person.
Yes, you do.
And some of it you lean into, like you might forgive it and keep asking for it and keep forgiving and keep asking, or you might just let it go and be like, well, yeah, that's not going to happen. And, maybe it will someday, but I'm not going to push it and I'm not going to ask for it, and I release it. And I think those are important ideas, because part of what we're looking at is not just how do you forgive somebody you're not in contact with anymore who did something a long time ago, but how do you forgive the person you're living with right now? Because there's this ongoing reality that we hope for things, and the person that we're living with may disappoint those hopes, is going to disappoint those hopes along the way. Yeah. So I think part of it is forgiving things that are ongoing. And I think there are some things that we need to forgive and then still have boundaries on.
Sure.
Because I think sometimes we can be living with somebody who is like, there's just something happening, some dynamic in the relationship that's actually really unhealthy.
Right.
And we need to recognize it and have some boundary on it and say that this isn't going to work for me.
Right. So
I need this to not happen anymore.
I mean, so your spouse or your son or your daughter is using drugs.
Yeah.
And they keep, and they keep doing it, or they stop and then they do it again and stop. And so there's forgiveness does not condone behavior.
Right.
Forgiveness is acknowledging that you don't have control over this person. Yeah. And that so you can let go of the demand that they stop. Yeah. And you can have boundaries and say, I don't have to participate in this.
You can say, I'm not going to facilitate it anymore.
Yes. So there's, so a lot of forgiveness is a releasing of a burden. And it's interesting because when Jesus dies on the cross and forgives us of our sins, he is taking the burden of sin itself, the hopelessness, the power of death over us, and taking it away from us. Yeah. And so in some ways, forgiving others is saying, okay, here's the burden, Jesus. Like, you take this. He tells us. And I think unforgiveness makes us very weary. Yeah. And very bitter and very controlling and very angry and depressed. Like, forgiveness is actually the key to being healthy. Yeah. So, go ahead. You were about to say something.
I think that thinking of forgiveness as separate from boundary building is helpful, because if we've actually entered into a space where we can be calm while we're thinking about this person, and we've released our requirements on them, then we can say, well, how do I want to live my life? And then we have a better framework for understanding what boundaries are necessary in order for us to live with integrity, even. Yeah. And I think that's something that boundary building is probably a whole different podcast, but something that should be done with some close friends, with a couple of other people looking at the situation and saying, yeah, something is off there. And I think something needs to be put into place. And what are some consequences that would be appropriate? What are some ways to reconcile the relationship after, to rebuild if consequences go into play, stuff like that.
So can we, just for people, because I know what's banging around in people's heads. So let's start with maybe an extreme example and walk this through just a little bit, because I think this will be helpful. If your father abused you sexually or physically when you were a child, and now you're an adult, and you haven't really processed a lot of this, Dad's still around, but you don't see him anymore. You've made the boundaries. You're like, I can't be around you. But you keep hearing people say, or now you're listening to this podcast and people are saying, well, you got to forgive them. Yeah. Well, what does that actually, I mean, what isn't it, but what does it look like to do that in this process? How would you kind of talk that through?
So I would think that forgiving that person is not saying that what they did was okay, but it is stepping into a place of calm and safety for yourself and acknowledging what happened as something, acknowledging what you hoped for. I hoped that I would be cared for. And maybe you didn't hope for it because it all happened so early or so young.
But you hope now.
But looking back, you hope for your young self that you would have been well cared for and protected and nurtured, and that you hope for something better. And maybe it's really helpful to say exactly what that was. This is what I hope had happened, what I wish had happened.
Right.
But what we hope for doesn't always happen, and it did not happen here. And yet I can still pursue the things I hope for now in my life. And the fact that those things happened to me in the past does not dictate what happens to me in the future. Or what I choose to do in the future, or what I build with my life, or what I pursue, or who I pursue.
Right. So part of forgiveness in this context is not allowing that person to have control over your narrative.
Yes.
So you are telling your story as a victim to that person, and each thing that happens in your life that's hard is backtracks itself to the thing that happened to you.
That is the potential that can happen with unforgiveness.
Yes.
Is a bitterness builds, and then the narrative of my life becomes this wrong thing happened to me. And then I started making all of it affected these choices, and it affected these things that happened. And so my whole narrative is about that person and what they did to me, where I'm the victim in the narrative. And I think that forgiveness is in part stepping from being a victim, which we all are at some level, at some time, victims, but not allowing victim to become my overarching identity.
Right.
And so I start building a narrative where I'm the victor, where I'm the hero of the story, where I say, this happened and it was really hard and it affected me for a long time. It affected things that happened in my life. It affected choices I made. And yet I have forgiven that person, and I'm moving in a new trajectory.
Right.
And I'm moving towards the things that I hope for and that I want to see happen in my life.
Yeah. And I think probably the things that I would kind of tack onto this that fit into what you were saying, and you said this earlier, is that in the safe space, once you've calmed your nervous system and you begin to hold both the person who has wronged you and hold your stabilized nervous system in your safe space, you can begin to have a conversation with Jesus about that person.
Yes.
And I think one of the things that forgiveness does ask us to do is not to necessarily reconcile, though that may be called on, but what it does is it invites us to look at that person with the compassion that Jesus has for them.
Yes.
So to give them their humanity. And
yes.
Unforgiveness does not give them their humanity. I think that's really an important aspect of this in releasing them from control over you, is allowing them to be human. And I think it's important because it allows you to move on without denying impact.
Yeah.
And so I think that's really key.
And I think the other thing that Jesus offers in that space is a victor identity. As we follow Jesus, we are victors in Christ.
Right.
And it's not just us by ourselves doing what we think matters in our lives. We are leaving behind old ways.
Yeah.
And we are stepping into new ways.
Yeah.
And Jesus is inviting us into hope and into a high calling with our life. And the ability to release the hard stuff from our past and former narratives and former identities is something that helps us then to follow Jesus and to step into a victorious way of living.
All right.
So I think those things are very rooted
yes.
in the gospel, really.
Yeah. I like that a lot.
Another thing that what you said just reminded me of is that there's this idea of taking things less personally.
Yeah.
So one of the ways of becoming objective as you're in a forgiveness process,
and this is good, guys, so you should listen to this,
is to recognize that the way that I have been hurt by this other person isn't just about me personally. It wasn't an affront to myself specifically, but thousands of other people have been hurt in the same way by other people. Or if I hadn't been the person who was standing in front of them, somebody else would have been hurt by them. It wasn't about me. It was just part of the suffering that was available in the world. And so as we step back a little bit and gain a little bit of objectivity on what's happened to us, we realize that we're not the only one. And so the victim narrative loses a little bit of power when we do that.
Yeah.
Because we can say, back to the example of a mom who has neglected her kids, if I hadn't been the kid there, then she would have been neglecting some other kid.
Right.
Or there are hundreds of thousands of other people who have been neglected by their moms.
Right.
So that goes back to the idea that we don't always get what we hope for.
Right.
And it's not to say that it didn't matter that it happened to you. It does matter that it happened to you. But it is a way that we can peel ourselves away from it a little bit.
Right.
And take it a little bit less personally.
Yeah.
And there's this idea of the river of suffering.
Yeah.
That comes up with people who have experienced really traumatic wrongs and forgiven them, is that we are all humans are in the river of suffering. Like we're all floating down this river. Somebody's kicking us in the head. We're kicking somebody else in the head. And we're being wronged along the way. We're doing wrong to other people along the way. And we're in this global river of suffering. And forgiveness allows us to hold that suffering kind of with an open hands and recognize, the suffering has happened to me and it's happening to other people also around me. And this is what we are in together. This is what we hold as humans.
And I think when you have talked about this before and you kind of build this up and then you say, Jesus dove into the river of suffering.
Yeah, and he was the one person in there who wasn't kicking other people in the head.
Right. Which is so powerful to think that he's in the river of suffering and he's not kicking anyone.
Yeah.
But he's being kicked.
To death.
Yes.
And
it killed him.
He was put to death by our river of suffering.
Yeah.
And overcame it and took his life back and has loved and served us both in that way and continues to do so. Called us into a new life of freedom. Well,
and what I think is really interesting is that the thing that Jesus invites us into and forgiving as he forgave us is to not get out of the river of suffering, but to actually create pockets of kingdom where people aren't kicking each other in the head, but are taking kicks and saying, no, Jesus has forgiven you.
Yeah.
I'll forgive you. And inviting people into something deeper and bigger and widening the circle within that. So the river has to flow around it and not through it. Mm-hmm. And I think that is the cool thing.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah. Well, I think unless you have something else for us to think through on forgiveness, I think this is our podcast.
No, I think those are the thoughts that I had batting around in my head for today.
Thank you, Susan. This was really good. Mm-hmm. I'm looking forward to the conversation that this creates in our community and at large. If you have questions about forgiveness, you can email us at healingthecity@gmail.com or villagersonline@gmail.com. This podcast is a ministry of the Village Church, and we definitely could use you giving us reviews and rating it. It's helpful in getting it out to the larger community. So go on Apple and Spotify, write us a review, give us a bunch of stars, and we really enjoy doing this. So thank you. You've been listening to Healing the City podcast with Susan Siepen and Eric Siepen. You can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook.